Welcome back to day 2 of this conference on climate change and agrarian justice. I would like to thank the interpreters for all their hard work in this conference and to remind you again that this conference is co-hosted by the Journal of Peasant Studies, the Transnational Institute, the Collective of Agrarian Scholar Activists of the Global South, and the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm a professor at PLAS at the University of Western Cape and one of the co-editors of JPS, and I'll be chairing today. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers today to join us. We have Natasha Brunner, a researcher in Mozambique, Jason Moore joining from the United States, and Amita Bhaviskar from India. I will introduce them in turn. And we will structure the conversation today around 3 rounds of discussion. The first will be impacts of climate change and how we even think about and understand impacts. And then we will move on to responses from above, responses from below, and how we understand responses to climate change. And then we'll think about what are the implications for particular struggles, for research, and for alliances. So to kick us off, I thought we might think about the recent experience of the floods in Pakistan. Adam Tooze recently wrote about the Pakistan floods. It should be a world historic moment. At this point, our habit of talking about climate change as a future risk has once and for all to stop. 1/3 of the 5th most populous country in the world, one of the most sensitive geopolitical hotspots on the planet, is underwater. 40 million people are displaced. The climate emergency has arrived. This is not a drill. That is Adam Tooze. So there is this discourse, and a lot of work has been done on the inducement of displacement through development over time, from settler colonialism to big dam projects to development corridors, mining and conservation. So I'd like to kick off the conversation by asking you, Natasha, first of all, what are the different aspects of climate change that you see in your region? And I'll then go on to Amita. But first, to introduce Natasha. Natasha Brunner is from the Observatorio de Meio Rural in Mozambique. She holds a PhD in development studies from ISS in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on agrarian change and the intersections of resource grabbing as a result of extractivism and environmental politics. She's currently the executive director of this organization. And before all this, her work was on the impacts of large-scale investments, focusing on the impacts on rural subsistence. She's part of a scholar activist collective called Alternactiva. I don't think that can be translated. A collective that aims for social justice and emancipation. So welcome, Natasha. And to kick us off then, can you talk about what you see as being the forms of climate change and the direct impacts in the areas in which you're working?
Thank you, Ruth. First of all, I have to say I'm very honored to be here in this panel talking about climate change from the perspective of the Global South. And answering your question, Ruth, I would say that I think climate change impacts can be interpreted in 2 broad ways. First, in terms of the biophysical manifestation of climate change, for instance, how extreme weather events impact on rural livelihoods, impact on cities, on displacement of people, and so on. And we know that those impacts are more intensified in Global South countries, and especially in rural areas of the Global South countries. But we also have to problematize this categorization, I would say, because different countries from the Global South also have differentiated impacts on climate change. But overall, what we see is the reproduction of underdevelopment, intensification of poverty, and increased asymmetry between center and periphery countries. But there is another way in which we should understand climate change impacts that goes beyond the direct or the explicit impacts of climate change. And this is on the context of the implementation of global policies to address climate change. This has to do with the fact that the solutions to address or the strategies to fight climate change are also shaping rural livelihoods and development. And my research showed that because these policies are land-based, because these policies are resource-based, I can give some examples: the promotion of tree plantations, promotion of biofuel production, and even conservation through REDD+ mechanisms. So this set of solutions actually constitute a new frontier of accumulation and has negative implications to rural livelihoods, such as intensifying expropriation, restricting access to forest resources, overall produces a rupture of rural livelihood strategies. In some, these policies are promoting resource grabbing and are promoting extractivism as well. So what we have to see here is that as a climate smart world, as they call it, is implemented, a wave of green resource rush is directed to global south countries. So these discourses are, from these mitigation policies, are actually facilitating processes of resource grabbing and part of this new frontier of accumulation.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And I suppose this helps us to move beyond the question of the biophysical impacts of temperature rises or rainfall volatility, extreme weather events, the impacts on soil and freshwater, or the Great Extinction, and to draw on a political economy perspective. At this point, I'd like to introduce Amita Bhaviskar, who is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University in India. Her research addresses the cultural politics of the environment and development in rural and urban India. And she's working now on food and changing agrarian environments in central India, focusing on air pollution and heat. Amita's books cover a wide variety of topics, including rivers, tribal conflicts, and dam projects, and she has worked on the commons in Delhi. A lot of her writings explore themes of resource rights, popular resistance, and discourses of environmentalism, and she's won numerous prizes for her work on environmental sociology and agrarian politics. Thank you so much for joining us, Amita. And I guess this leads us quite nicely into thinking about how impacts of climate change articulate with ongoing and deepening forms of agrarian crisis and struggle that are happening anyway. And perhaps you can tell us from your context and your work how you see and understand climate impacts in the Indian context, particularly.
Thank you, Ruth. I guess many people here must have read about the strong and really sustained farmers' protests that happened across North India in the last 2 years. And what those protests showed was that even in the richest regions of state-subsidized agriculture, the agrarian crisis is intense. Farming doesn't allow most rural families to make a living. They have to keep one foot in the urban economy, working low-paying jobs to make both ends meet. And climate change has just added another layer to this widespread distress. Let me just give you 2 examples. One, that most work on agrarian crisis has focused on land, but water is equally important in India, and access to water has been the chief constraint on agriculture, which has been historically resolved through building large dams, mining underground aquifers at huge financial and ecological cost. But the ways in which climate change has changed rainfall and water recharge, droughts and floods has really exacerbated the problem around water. Also, rural livelihoods depend on complex and carefully timed interactions between plant and animal ecologies. So with climate change, we find that fishers off the coast of Western India can't find mackerel where they used to because ocean temperatures have changed. Changes in temperature also mean that apple growers in the Himalayas can no longer rely on punctual flowering and pollination. And thanks to monocropping, fruit growers had put all their apples in one basket, and that basket is now upset. So agriculture has always been an uncertain enterprise. What climate change has done has been to amplify this uncertainty. The risks for small farmers and laborers in dryland regions, those who labor under a continuing legacy of dispossession and exclusion, most especially the scheduled castes and tribes, Dalits and Adivasis. All of these risks were already backbreaking, but now people are even more vulnerable. And I think this is what is new. No one, not even the richest farmers in the most prosperous regions, are secure anymore.
Thanks so much. Amita, already what you've pointed to is in a sense how a lot of the climate change mainstream discourse is very productionist. It focuses on rural communities as producers rather than actually the way you framed it, which is a wider crisis of social reproduction that the crisis is intersecting with. And the second aspect is how this is overlaid on existing classes of capital and labor. So this seems like a good point to push towards a broader perspective, which is sort of taking a step back beyond these contemporary contexts and thinking about where this comes from and how we understand it. So we're very happy to have Jason Moore here. Jason is a professor and environmental historian, historical geographer at Binghamton University. He's a professor of sociology and leads the World Ecology Research Collective. And he's an author and editor of various books, Capitalism in the Web of Life, Anthropocene or Capitalocene. I understand that it has been possible to interpret those words into our languages today. And he also produced a book with Raj Patel called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. He's also received a number of awards. So welcome, Jason, and thanks for getting up early in the morning. So you've critiqued the idea of an Anthropocene, this idea that climate change is the result of people, and also the timing of this era, this epoch that we're living in, as associated with the Industrial Revolution, as if we just need to get rid of dirty energy. We can get through this within capitalism. So what is it about capital and capitalism, and what is it about this moment of the late 20th century, 21st century form of neoliberal capitalism that is bringing about these transformations, and how does that help us to think in a different way about climate change and climate change impacts?
Thank you, Ruth. It's a great question, and everything that I say will actually affirm what Amita and Natasha so brilliantly and cogently laid out. In my view, the great weakness of the contemporary left in the academy and outside is what I would call a flight from world history. I think that this is a consequence of neoliberal ideology and its end of history and clash of civilizations arguments. So what does that mean to take seriously the long history, not of man and nature, which are inventions of the imperialist project and the civilizing project after 1492, but of climate and class? So those ideas are deeply practical because they allow us to confront the neo-Malthusian ideology of man versus nature and its whitewash and greenwash and imperial wash of history, this narrative grabbing that we are, the critique of ideology and political practice is indeed a struggle, a narrative struggle, amongst other things. So what does it mean if we shift our optic to climate and class That is, understanding that the long history of climate change in the history of human civilization is not something external like a billiard ball, but something fundamental and internal. And the key takeaway here, and people can go to jasonwmoore.com if you want more and more detail, is that unfavorable moments of climate change are very bad for ruling classes. This has been true indeed since the great Bronze Age crisis around 1200 BCE. It was emphatically true in the crisis of the Roman West in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, when, remember, the slaveholding ruling classes of the era were brought to their knees and peasants reinvented life. There was a peasant mode of production. It was a dark age for the rich and powerful. It was a golden age for the peasantry in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries. Again, with the crisis of feudalism and the arrival of the Little Ice Age, this marked a historic defeat of Europe's ruling classes and a golden age for peasants and workers for a century and a half. This was true again when, as a result of the not anthropogenic but capitalogenic forcing of the New World genocides, we have the Orbis spike and the most intense, coldest period of the Little Ice Age between 1550 and 1700. There's revolt, there's revolution, there's economic and political crisis and stability. That's good for ruling classes. Now, the outcome in that moment was something that you mentioned, 2/3 of the trinity of climate apartheid as an ideological formation, climate patriarchy as an ideological and institutional formation, always enabling fundamentally the climate class divide. And we need to put those two together as a rich totality. And then finally, what do we have in the present moment? Well, we have a capitalogenic crisis that if we look at it, if we understand today's crisis, not as driving and creating this climate capitalogenic trinity of the class divide, the apartheid, and patriarchy and climate terms, but we understand that its birth was in this period of 1550 to 1700, we begin to understand how these dynamics of oppression and exploitation are fundamental to each other.
Thanks so much. You make powerful points, but I want to push you a little, Jason. So if you're saying, and I think that you're referencing Maria Mies, what is this about? This is about the appropriation from women, from nature, from the colonies. We must look at patriarchy, climate, and imperialism together. But you seem to draw from history a view of climate crisis is bad for the ruling class, yet simultaneously you've worked on cheap nature. And of course, you show that nature and the appropriation of nature doesn't come cheap. And we know that the costs are borne somewhere. They're often borne in ways that are not always obvious, often by women in the developing world. So, on the one hand, cheap nature is being created, but it's also proving profitable. So how do you reconcile that on the one hand, you say climate crisis is good for ruling classes, but on the other hand, nature is rendered cheap? Surely, actually, the ruling classes right now are profiting in various ways through responses to the climate crisis.
So climate change is bad for ruling classes. It's the climate crisis today is in fact bad for capitalism. You can see this most spectacularly in the yield suppression effects on advanced capitalist agriculture in motion for 3 decades. But more to the point, cheap nature, and I can't stress this enough, is always a double valence. It's about cost reduction, yes, but it's also about cheapening in the English language sense of the word. So the valorization of capital and the cultural devaluation is a strategy of not just divide and conquer, but after Mamdani, define and rule. And none of the strategies today, Ruth, to your point, are counteracting the profound stagnation and overaccumulation of capital.
Okay, so thanks. That's very helpful, because then that leads us to the question about this paradox, really, about how nature is on the one hand cheapened, but often cheapened through commodification. So I would like to now move on to another round. And while we do this, I see that there's a request for more details about your published work, Amita. We'll share that. But please do add your questions in the Q&A in response to the speakers so far, and also comment in the chat. So if we move now to thinking about responses, and if we think about responses to climate crisis from above and from below, I want to ask you, Natasha, your work, your doctoral work and beyond has focused on the idea of green extractivism. You've sort of shown how capitalism converts a climate crisis into another frontier of capitalism, as you say. And you criticize top-down agrarian mitigation and adaptation policies. So maybe you can just tell us, how does then climate crisis and the cheapening of nature also become a new mechanism of accumulation through green extractivism? And how is it playing out in Mozambique?
Before going straight to the question, maybe I should just add that what is happening in the Global South, and particularly to the rural population of the Global South, is that they're mostly carrying the burden of the crisis itself, and we can see that with the discussion of the impacts and diverse impacts, but the rural population is also carrying the responsibility of this historical industrialization process, as well as the adverse effects of the same capitalist solution. So these paved the way to the emergence of green extractivism. So what is green extractivism? It is actually a variation of extractivism in which resource appropriation and extraction are materialized through these mitigation policies and legitimized by green discourses. I'll give an example from Mozambique, and this is a reserve in the central region of Mozambique called Gilé National Reserve. This area was reestablished under the umbrella of REDD+, and as a consequence, what happened is that rural households that were living in the surroundings of the reserve, they lost access to forest resources. They were no longer able to hunt, to fish, and have access to other forest resources that were determinant for their livelihoods. And besides that, they also had to change their production techniques to minimize emissions, adopting climate-smart agriculture so that they minimize emissions and also protect the biodiversity of the reserve. So the main goal here is carbon sequestration, and then selling carbon permits to multinationals, to industrialized countries. And we see that many actors throughout the whole carbon commodity chain are profiting based on this scheme. So this is actually part of the new frontier that I've mentioned. We have green investments, tree plantation projects, but we also have conservation projects that are extracting something, and they are extracting emission rights. So green extractivism constitutes the process through which emission rights are being expropriated from rural poor through the implementation of mitigation policies and then legitimized by green discourses. So how do we understand this? We understand this as a clear manifestation of climate injustice. Why? Because the adverse implications, because we see adverse implications to rural livelihoods, to rural poor. And these are people that did not contribute as much to the current crisis, but they are the ones that have to change their ways of living to protect biodiversity and to maximize sequestration. So what is happening, once again, is that Global South is feeding or subsidizing Global North industrialization or other regions in the process of industrialization. Countries such as Mozambique are subsidizing and feeding accumulation and ways of living in other parts, more developed parts of the world. And all of this is happening at the cost of rural poor in Mozambique, in Gilé National Reserve, cutting into the necessary consumption of this population. So this is
such a powerful point. But I mean, Natasha, there's so much converging in this one country, which has been both directly affected by a series of extreme weather events and cyclones, but at the same time as being a center of green extractivism. It's also the target of major fossil fuel expansion in the oil and gas industries. So in a sense, both the fossil fuel expansion and oil exploration and so on, causing and intersecting with conflicts locally, along with the green extractivism. Are these happening in the same places? How do you make sense of these two sort of contradictory sides of the climate crisis playing out in one place?
Yes, I think this just shows how there isn't a clear or cohesive, solid public agenda for Mozambican development path. It is all shaped by external resources and external interests. We have to understand that most African countries, governments, while the state might be authoritarian, but it is at the same time hostage of international financial institutions. So the development path, the public agenda is actually being shaped by these external interests, from the World Bank to the IMF and even philanthropic organizations. So until we do not have autonomy and capacity to fuel and design a model of development that actually prioritizes internal needs and challenges, we will keep having these contradictory public policies fueling external industrialization and intensifying dependency and underdevelopment. Okay,
so thank you very much for that. I just want to note, I'm going to come back to you, Amita. You also looked at the sort of struggles around alternatives, and you referenced the recent massive farmer protests in India. And I want to ask you in a moment to elaborate a little bit on, what does this teach us about the potential for responses to climate crisis being not about climate, but inclusive of climate and broader, and not falling victim to kinds of Hindu nationalism or communalism, the potential for farmers' movements to build broad alliances. So I'm going to come to that in a moment. But before that, let's just do justice to some of the questions that are emerging. Javier says, Jason Moore says, historically bad climate is bad for ruling class. Building from examples of European history, does this argument hold outside of European history? Also for Jason, Sergio says, how is the process of nature cheapening coherent with those projects for valuing nature, for example, through carbon crediting? I think you partly responded to that. And Livia says, please can we go deeper into the questions of stagnation of accumulation for capital? During the Corona crisis, even before 2008, we saw the ruling elites actually the only ones profiting from crises. So again, this question of, never waste a good crisis, that financialization and the growth of more virtual economies are not based on a material reality anymore and are fundamentally about speculation. Don't you think that this changes how ruling elites react to crisis? And perhaps we could add questions of technology also into that context. So we'll get back to that later. But Amita, so thinking about what we've learned from the farmer protests in India and other attempts of building connections in response to contest climate change and wider agrarian crises of capitalism from below, what have we learned? Amita, just unmute.
Sorry.
Got it.
I wanted to say that I want to reserve that question of alliances a little later when we talk about the implications of the crisis and moving forward and the lessons we might draw, and speak much more here about the responses to climate crisis, which I think, in fact, indicates some of the challenges to how we might work together in order to achieve agrarian justice, ecological justice. And to my mind, again, drawing from events in India in the recent past, two things are really striking. One of them is that for all of us who work on agro-ecological justice, the farmers' movement's silence about the ecological devastation caused by fossil fuel-driven, land and water destroying, chemically toxic agriculture, and ecological crisis that's been amplified by climate change, has really been deafening. But in many ways, it's also understandable because for most parts, farmers in North India who have been beneficiaries of the Green Revolution have been made to forget other forms of farming, growing crops like millets and pulses, which have been more suited to local climate and ecology, crops that were displaced to grow monocultures of hybrid wheat and rice. So their response has been to demand that the state continue to subsidize the capital-intensive cultivation they profited from for 2 generations. Never mind that the system is now broken. It's farmers in other parts of India, those who've been less reliant on state subsidies, those who have faced the limits of nature and the depredations of commodity markets much earlier, they are turning towards other crops, other farming practices, other kinds of arrangements, especially cooperative ones. So in all regions, we see agrarian distress in different ways, but the responses to it are shaped not only by class and caste, but by political histories of engagement with the state. And the second point I want to make is about state responses, because these are absolutely central to understanding the problems and prospects opened up by climate change. We know the language of the Anthropocene, as Jason has pointed out, which conjures up a global we, diffuses and depoliticizes any discussion of responsibility in action, and legitimizes techno-managerial solutions. In India, much of the discussion around climate change has focused on international negotiations, where the Indian government, as a post-colonial nation exercising its right to develop, has occupied the moral high ground in the debate. And this assumption about national virtue actually fails to acknowledge the huge class-based disparities in emissions within the country. And what I think is even more glaring, that the government's determinedly committed to fossil fuel-driven production in partnership with its favorite corporations, especially the Adani Group. So the present government's policies around land, water, minerals have become even more destructive of the environment and of the people who directly depend on it for sustenance. So a discourse of national development is drummed up to suppress all critiques and challenges. And this doublespeak is very similar to what Natasha describes for Mozambique, where you have, oil-based extraction and further exploration, along with claims to conservation.
And of course, this doublespeak doesn't emerge by chance. So, Jason, perhaps your take on responses to climate crisis, if we think about at the macro level, how responses emerge from capital transnationally. So there might be very local realities, but there's clearly quite a coherent and conscious response by, I think, what you've termed the imperialist transnationalist class. So what is this class, and how do you understand its strategies of response?
Well, the first thing, it's a great question. And the first thing that we want to grasp is the unity and diversity, as Marx might say. That's the beauty of dialectics. It embraces variation. It embraces the groundedness. So what we see today is actually very much a response to a situation that was brought up in the questions, which is, yes, some capitalists are making a killing off of the pandemic, of the climate crisis. But for capital as a whole, it is today at the end of the road in its strategy of cheap nature. That means simply, it's complex, but simply that there's too much capital to be reinvested profitably. It's amplified by climate, not as a separate dynamic, but as constitutive of capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life. It means that there is, for instance, $19 trillion in government securities parked at zero or negative rate of return. So that suggests there's a massive overaccumulation problem. Now, getting to your point, that means that we have entered into a zero-sum situation for capital, which is absolutely untenable. And if we look at the history of the past century, we have two arguments that are central. The history of social revolutions in the post-colonial world, when they reached zero-sum situations, were violent and bloody revolutionary struggles. This is Jeff Page, this is James Scott, this is many other people from that era. And the other, of course, is Lenin's insight that once monopoly capitalism and the imperialist forces have enclosed the globe, the wars of redivision commence. So if we are looking at a response in terms of a contradictory response, it is the wars of redivision. And we can see this with the resurgence of inter-imperialist war in the Ukraine between the US and the United States and Russia.
You ended more abruptly than I thought you would. But now, if you're saying that the crisis is good for some capitalists, clearly highly profitable, but bad for capitalism overall. But we are not in the same boat, and capitalism is not going down with a whimper. In the course of these wars of redivision, what are the kinds of specific strategies? I'm thinking from the West, from the East, the difference between perhaps the kinds of responses from the kind of Western Davos kind of world versus, say, from the East, the logic of Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, that's precisely
part
right.
Of the wars of redivision?
That's exactly right. That we're seeing the final terminus of American unipolarity, which has been in motion since 1945, where the Russia-China condominium is clearly a play for a post-capitalist world, for a tributary mode of production that will look in many respects like the one that we have now, but will essentially take the logic of too big to fail to the next step. On the other side, you have an absolutely untenable alliance between Davos and the transnational capitalist class and the old trilateralist zone of Japan, North America, Western Europe, with the war machine of the United States, which seems to know no better motto than to say, I stand with Raytheon.
So one of the problems then is not only the problem of a global we, there's also a problem of a nationalist we. And we see that in many parts of the developing world where African and a lot of progressive movements have bought into a very narrow form of a nationalist we, trying to get a better deal through green capitalism. At the same time, we see a lot of techno fixes. And I want to come back to this idea you didn't mention by name, Natasha, but a lot of what you were referring to were the kinds of false solutions that we see in many parts of the world. Particularly, we see technical kinds of responses, but also amid this, a lot of policy shift more generally that affects people in rural areas, in agrarian spaces. We're seeing the reversal of land laws, the enforcement of different seed laws, and all amid forms of authoritarianism. Now, this seems to be something that connects in many ways a lot of the African debate with the Indians. I'd like to throw it back to both you, Natasha and Amita. You know, as this war of redivision unfolds, there's growing authoritarianism. How are people responding to that?
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
We see that, at least looking in the context of Mozambique, there are some localized responses to move away from these mainstream top-down solutions of climate change. But I think that there is still place to build a more coherent nationwide or transnational movement towards agrarian and climate justice. But of course, there's a case that is worth mentioning. It's a specific case that I've been working together with Boaventura Monjane for the last year. It's still a work in progress, and we call it as climate action from below. And this is a case of a community in central Mozambique as well, in the same province as the reserve, but in a different district. And in this community, you have this collaboration between the local households, local rural households, and an environmental organization, social movement called Justiça Ambiental, in English, Environmental Justice. This is the name of the organization. And what does this initiative include that is worth mentioning here is that they are having a horizontal collaboration about climate change and mitigation and adaptation strategies. They discuss and they explore together with the communities the best way towards adaptation, the best way towards protecting the biodiversity of that place, because they have around almost 8,000 hectares of community forest conservation, and they're working together with the organization. They also are implementing practices and agroecology projects, livestock activities, all based on local traditional practices. Also, they have the creation of farmer and poultry farmer association for developing sustainable income generation. But these projects, and this is important to mention, these projects are continuously adapted and readapted and redesigned to respond to local aspirations and to priorities of the community itself. So what does it make this initiative different from these mainstream top-down initiatives? So the first thing is that there is participation of local actors. In policies such as REDD+ and climate smart agriculture, there is almost none participation of local actors from the planning, designing, and implementation of the projects. And the second thing that differs is the horizontal relation, but also the equal access to information. In mainstream top-down policies, there's actually asymmetry of information. So the fact that in this project they have symmetry of information, you see a sense of appropriation by the community itself, because they're working towards their own interests. And the last one, and I think this is the most important one, is that this kind of initiatives are non-extractive or non-extractivists, because the projects are from the community to benefit the community for local consumption. So, and at the end, it actually benefits globally, right? But without expropriation and without extracting locally. But one thing I would like to say before the conclusion is that even these initiatives are not free of problems. We talked about, for example, gender issue, how women, they carry the burden of this kind of the implications of climate change. And in this, even in this initiative that is considered to be climate action from below, there's still a bit of gender issues because it's culturally there, right? But of course, this is still a problem, but other ways of oppression at least are not there. So I think it's important to highlight the existence of these initiatives that can constitute fairer approaches to co-construction of solutions to the climate crisis.
Thank you. And that sort of leads us centrally into the question of how we can, in a sense, overcome this or think through the disjuncture between, on the one hand, the kind of world system-wide character of a climate crisis and the scale of responses from above and the scale of responses from below. Clearly a massive challenge. Just before we get on to any additions from Amita, I want to mention that from the Q&A, we have a few comments about Pakistan. Mita Ram says South Asia is suffering so badly because of climate change. The recent Pakistan floods is one example, though Pakistan is not a contributor towards climate change, but is suffering because of others. What measures can be taken? Siraj Ahmed says that the floods resulted in massive devastation of life, properties, livestock, animals, and crops. What could be the best steps to overcome these destructive results? And without a doubt, these floods are because of changes in climate conditions. We've been warned of more floods and food scarcity. And I suppose that also emphasizes that when thinking about impacts, not only are there the impacts of climate change and even the responses to climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, but there are also the ramifications for food system functioning. And I think that yesterday, Antolin from Peru, representing Via Campesina, was saying that actually the food system is the entry point for contesting the narrative and the politics of climate change. Just one more point about Pakistan. Hashim Rashid says one of the tricky problems that Pakistan faces is how much its agrarian geographies have been shaped by colonialism. It's shares this condition with Indian Punjab. So it's not surprising that mainstream farmers' movements are unable to imagine a significantly different future in such a context. How does one even begin to disentangle how radically the 20th century reshaped these agrarian spaces? So the climate crisis is overlaid on already the agrarian crisis that is the unfolding of many centuries and decades. There's a specific question to you, Amita, that perhaps you could respond to, which is Mizinska Daimari says, how would you respond to the view that the alternative agricultural systems are uneconomical and unviable in a marginal farming environment such as India? I'm not sure that you would agree. And there is a question in Spanish, which I think could go to any of you, which has been translated as, how do you see the problem of the subsumption of the peasantry in the logic of the reproduction of capital as dependent on agrochemicals and markets? A peasant strategy is coherent as small individualized owners and producers. And then finally, just before we get back to you, Amita, there's another response that I wanted to collect in a moment. People are calling for more information, please, about your work in Mozambique, Natasha, and perhaps it is particularly about the struggles in Mabe, Justicia Ambiental, and also the wider victories that have been created through, for instance, the mobilization against the Pro-Savannah program, which was the one big attempt at of global agrarian capital to annex parts of Mozambique. So Amita, do you have any response to those particular takes on India and Pakistan?
Yeah. First, to that question about the viability of any kind of agriculture, I'd say that one has to think about how viability actually gets constructed through state policies of different kinds. A cheap food policy in India has been made possible by directing huge amounts of resources, taxpayers' money into a green revolution model. It's based on huge subsidies from what are, what should be public goods, land and water and, all the natural flora and fauna that makes up our biodiversity. So the viability question really needs to be looked at carefully in terms of what is exactly viable, for how long and for whom, and who's paying the price. So I think if one re-looks at forms of sustainable agriculture, one would get a very different set of costs and benefits than if one looked at green revolution agriculture, which is propped up by all kinds of state guarantees in terms of buying produce at minimum support prices and so on. On the question of the floods in Pakistan and floods similar to what have been experienced in southern India, also, of course, the Indian subcontinent shares the monsoons, which have become enormously more variable with climate change. These things tend to pop up into consciousness when there's a crisis, and then public attention declines. And what we don't get a sense of is the systemic ways in which global warming has induced climate change, at the planetary level. But we're also dealing with forms of capitalist development in urban and rural areas, which are national and regional and local. So the reason why water can't get back into the soil anymore, can't recharge in urban areas, is to do with the fact that urban development has happened in what were once ponds and aquifers and floodplains. The reason why you see flooding is because the ways in which river basins are ecologically arranged has been hugely tampered with by the diversion of rivers through large dams and so on. I won't go into the details, but this is very familiar hydrological history for most people on the subcontinent. I want to actually say that along with these climate disasters which come and go, but which don't seem to get added on to our sense of political priorities. I want to just get to that point a little bit, because when I see what current politics is all about, people are experiencing jobless growth. They're increasingly experiencing very high levels of inflation. There's an economic crisis that's particularly acute, especially for educated youth who see a bleak future because they have all sorts of aspirations fueled by capitalism, but they're basically watching others get richer while they themselves go no forward. There's a lot of anger and resentment, and I think that's been harnessed in the Indian case by the hate politics of the Hindu majoritarian government. But it's also fueling the kind of populism we see in other countries around the world. And that's why when we see protests by farmers, or we see the kinds of initiatives that Natasha described, they seem like such a breakthrough because they're bringing to the fore questions of caste and class and race and the role of the state in relation to corporate capital. And in the Indian case, I think it's really exciting to see an emerging students movement reaching out to the farmers, making alliances between people fighting against displacement, against inroads by corporate capital. And I think these kinds of fights and alliances can be seen as, in a way, struggling for climate justice by other means, even when climate isn't on top of their list of actions. The last thing that I want to say is that, of course, there are lots of contradictions, and they need to be addressed through dialogue and debate. And nor can we minimize the challenges that exist, because the ability to organize collectively has really been systematically crushed over the last few decades. And people's alternatives, imagination about alternatives has also been impoverished. So it's a long and hard struggle, especially when the state calls activists anti-national, when it arrests them, throws them into jail for years on end. And this is what we are living with. This is what we must prepare ourselves for, a very long and hard struggle where hope must be sustained by whatever little victories we can seize, because ecological justice is really about fighting for the earth and for life. And we have to be continuously creative and persistent. As Michael Watts is fond of reminding us, the Chinese ideograph for crisis is also the same as opportunity. I think this is what Jason was also saying. So how we turn this crisis into an opportunity and how do we exploit it to its greatest to seek ecological justice and climate justice is the challenge before us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amita. So let me then turn that question over to Jason then to hear your response. If people are needing to and are finding forms of alternatives at various scales, how do you think about the implications for struggle, research, and alliances based on your analysis of the nature of the climate crisis emerging within and from capitalism? How do you see the way forward?
It's a great question, and Amita and Natasha, brilliant, really, really important interventions here. And so I want to support that. And I think how I want to go is that I want to say, first of all, that in the tradition of dialectical and anti-imperialist Marxism, we need to put at the center the dynamics of capital, class, and imperialism in the web of life, at every turn. And that means something very, very important and very, very different from the return to bourgeois nationalism, both on the right and the left in recent years, where class has been evacuated and reduced to a list of capitalism's bads. Now, in terms of what is to be done, we have all these wonderful, and I don't say that sarcastically, very generative and important and significant discourses, degrowth, Green New Deal, all of this. If we don't go back, and what we need to do, let me say it in positive terms, is to go back and look at the conjuncture of the 1970s, when in both the imperialist countries, like the Labour left government that comes in 1974 in the UK, in Sweden with the radical version of the Meidner Plan to expropriate capital, but also across the global south, as we know, Allende, and then in even poorer countries. We have projects to fundamentally democratize investment and to engage in reconstruction in various ways. And we know what happened in that conjuncture. It wasn't simply the triumph of neoliberal ideas. It was, and this is not controversial, a soft MI6, MI5, CIA, IMF coup of the Wilson government in Britain. It was the bloody destruction of the Allende efforts. It was the prolongation of South African imperialism in Southwest Africa. It was a whole set of processes. It brings me back to Machiavelli's distinction between armed profits and unarmed profits. And much as we like to, frankly, shit on the state socialist experiences, I think that there's a lot of criticism to be made, and sorry to be vulgar, but we also have to understand those as vital contributions to a socialist imaginary of reconstruction. And how does one both defend revolutionary gains and advance them in the terrain of basic human well-being, and, by the way, the well-being of the entire planet. As Max Ull just said, that the Soviet defeat of the Nazis was a big win for humanity and the planet. Those are not footnotes to what is happening today. And so I want to plead that we go back and do sober assessments rather than dismissals of these experiences to trace their implications for socialist strategy and climate justice in the present.
Okay, but Jason, you've also been asked to say whether or not your analysis, which is based on essentially a story of examples from European history about whether bad climate is bad for ruling classes, does this argument hold outside of European history in a context of imperialism? And what does that mean for a response?
Well, there are two different elements. There's an imperialism arc, but there's the broader arc. No, absolutely. That first of all, Rome and the Bronze Age civilizations were not European. Both Rome and the Bronze Age civilizations were Eurasian, and that's a very interesting climate part of the story. Because when the North Atlantic Oscillation turns positive and brings warm air into Northern Europe, it often, not always, but often brings drought into Eurasia and the Levant. And the dynamics of how climate is woven into modes of production is, as I said, inseparable. It's not a separate factor. And so, yes, indeed. Or we can look at the Little Ice Age that brings severe cold to Northern Europe. It brings drought to Sub-Saharan Africa, which is fundamental to the pulsations of the slaving frontier and the drawing of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy. You see, so yes, indeed, there is a wider cross-climatic zone impact. And so we need to look at that. And the way that China survived, this is extremely crude, is it was when it was able to knit together the two great river valleys, it was much more stable. And when capitalism was able to achieve a climate fix in the 17th century, it was driving hard towards the tropics.
So that actually takes us back to the point that was raised earlier. I believe it was in the chat, which was in what ways does your longue durée history of the emergence of climate crisis in the capitalist scene actually prefigure or tell us about the way in which this then plays out? And the two questions were about, well, what about the technologies that are available now? for capital to shift costs? And what about financialization? So that's essentially about spatial temporal fixes. What are the limits of that? And what does that mean for building struggles and alliances by movements and researchers' responses if we understand the scope for displacing costs through financialization and technology?
Well, the shortest possible answer is that both of those, financialization and technological history, depend on frontiers of cheap nature in various ways. Even for fossil fuels, you can think of the steam engine developed at the pit head of mines to drain water. We are in the midst of, and Amita actually sketched this out very well, we're in the midst of a deepening and systemic stagnation of that green revolution capital-intensive model. It can no longer deliver the goods. It is experiencing faltering productivity growth and has been for decades. So what does this tell us? Financialization is a symptom of the failure of capitalism to generate new frontiers of cheap nature that offset the overaccumulation of capital. They're simply not profitable investment opportunities. So it goes into finance, which then goes into the war machines. That's a crucial climate moment. The other is about technology. Since the 70s, as many of us know, the business press has been telling us robot factories are coming. There's this huge technological future. It hasn't materialized. In fact, we've been living through the greatest era of technological stagnation in the history of capitalism since the 1970s. And that has everything
Jason,
to do.
I'm going to butt in and ask you now a direct question because we're going to finish up. So, beyond describing this context and where we get, how we've got here and what it means, what does this mean in practical terms for responses? What's your way forward?
It means build political movements that can democratize the savings and investment process that we now know as capital accumulation.
And what are the elements of that?
Well, you have to wrest state power, and then you have to either discipline capital or socialize key strategic economic sectors in order to pursue a sustainable justice strategy.
Okay, so we already see elements of that struggle playing out in many parts of the world. And Natasha, I'd like to give you an opportunity. Perhaps, Amita, you drew us to a close so beautifully a little while ago. Maybe, Natasha, you could bring us to an end with your sense of, given ongoing struggles, the fights in response to climate shock, but also green extractivism, fossil fuel expansion, overlaid on centuries and decades of agrarian crisis in Mozambique and elsewhere where you work around the continent and beyond. There have been victories. And there are fights to reclaim, defend, and expand the commons, which in a sense is the frontier of this struggle, and to connect that with food system change. What is your thought about where research and struggles and alliances are most fruitful and bear most potential for bringing about change at local level and beyond?
First, I think it's important to have a joint agenda, agrarian and climate agenda. We cannot talk about climate justice and forget about land struggles and agrarian struggle. Mozambique is an example of that. We can talk about climate justice, but at the same time, our land law is being revised so that land can be privatized. So this is a very important issue as well. So we have to have joint agendas. The second thing, it's important to recognize these asymmetric exchange relations between regions when designing the solutions to climate change. This is very important. These are the two main things that I wanted to say, but it's important to keep in mind, at least on my own view, with my own experience, that we are constantly, when we give recommendations and we want to achieve these idealistic scenarios, so we've been, as academics and even as activists, we're constantly navigating between what is ideal and what is doable. And in my opinion, it is important to discuss these idealistic solutions But the challenge is how to migrate from abstract and ambitious recommendations and alternatives to implementation to achieve real change. So I think recommendations should start from realizing how to make a bridge between this, between degrowth, for example, if you want to achieve this idea of degrowth, and what is feasible given the context, unless we're planning a revolution, right?
So action at multiple scales, but understanding and sharing of understanding is critical in all of this. So I want to thank this incredible panel for your incredible experience and generosity and thoughtfulness.